So hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this inspiring, fantastic event. So without further ado, I'll start. First, I'll briefly introduce myself. I started my academic adventure with Mongolic languages. And on the top, you can see one of my best memories in my life. This is the photo with the Mongolian president, Mr. Elbekdorj. And prior to joining the Fosterlang project, I led a project devoted to multilingualism and biodiversity in Thailand. So I mainly specialize in minority languages from Asia. However, I myself also come from a region in Poland. It's called Podlachia, where we have several minoritized languages, and one of them is Podlachian, and this is also the language that my family members and myself speak and understand. Today I'm talking about technologies, so I just wanted to mention very briefly the reason why I chose this topic. I worked in an IT company in the past. I also co-supervised a master thesis devoted to speech synthesis to a actually almost dead language, Manchu, in northern China. Also, I surveyed with my colleagues the opportunities for the development of voice technologies in Thailand. And also, together with my colleague, Professor Delphine Bernard, we created a Dagur language corpus. Dagur language is a Mongolic language. Today, Catalina has already mentioned the survey that we work on together in our project. And I believe it's a good idea to mention this also very briefly and thank many persons who were involved in the development and implementation of this project module. So the survey that Catalina mentioned in the morning is dedicated, among others, to surveying the presence of language technologies for minoritized languages in Europe. It also surveys the possibilities for collaboration between our project partners and these communities in the further development of such tools, as well as it tackles potential opportunities and challenges in achieving a digital equality in the future. The survey was developed by the University of Warsaw, University of the Highlands and Islands, Dublin City University, and Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. I'm going to also mention other institutions in a second. So far, we have several language versions: Polish, English language version for Ireland, Gaelic language version for Scotland, English language version for Scotland, Irish language version for Ireland, Slovene language version for Carinthia, German language version for Carinthia, and also we are working on launching the Basque, Spanish, and French language versions for Basque-speaking communities in Spain and in France. This is, among others, how we advertised the survey before. So, for example, this is a JPG file, but also there was a movie and also other ways of advertising the survey. This is an example of how we advertised it in different languages. And because we are in the Basque country, also we wanted to invite you all soon to take part in these surveys. Here I wanted to say thank you to the University of Teacher Education in Carinthia, to Dania and Elizaveta and Pamela and Anna for testing and advising us. I would like to thank University of the Basque Country as well, so Ibon and Jone and June and Itziar for translation and future testing as well. And advice, I would like to say thank you to LinguaPax International for translating the survey into French. And also a huge thank you goes to European Language Equality Network for launching the survey and creating such a nice and beautiful aesthetic frames for the survey. The survey was coded by myself and Dr. Arvid Kumar from Max Planck Institute. One of the collaborators also Academia Siciliana. We are still waiting for some further communication. And here In this moment, I would like to say thank you as well to the students from the University of Warsaw, Mr. Grzegorz Kaliński, Krzysztof Dąbrowski, and Wojciech Soczyński, whom I would like to invite now to share a few comments about their perspective on working in the Fosterlang project. Okay, so I think that today we talked about various types of language technologies, and this is just a reminder in general what we can do with language, both in dominant and under-resourced languages. But before we think of even developing digital tools for minoritized languages, we'll definitely need to discuss before with these communities, for example, the benefits of developing such tools, if there will be any benefits in a given time and place. Also, the data that we enter into the language models, we also need to think carefully what kind of worldview the data represents. And also competing orthographies. This is also something that we have to take into consideration, and I'm going to focus more on this topic today. And also legacy and heritage data that Paul mentioned today in his presentation. So how do we collect data, linguistic data? Well, we, especially from under-resourced languages, we have to introduce first the methodologies of language documentation and revitalization. And I thought it would be a good idea to talk very briefly about it. So the language documentation is the method of researching minority languages and their use. For example, we can create audiovisual samples of how language is used. We can document how everyday language is also used in practice. And also, I think it's quite interesting, the speaker's attitude is also part of language documentation. And collecting this data, we know how a language is employed in various situations and contexts in given communities. As also, I think I would like to allude to what Paul said. So an organized collection of linguistic data is called corpus. And why do we need it? Well, first of all, we need it for mother tongue education. We also need it to increase the social status of a given language. And in some cases, we also need corpora to learn or relearn a language and thereby revitalize it. And then when we have a copy of a corpus, we can store it in an archive. Also, just like Paul mentioned, our corpus needs to be accompanied by metadata, and I'm going to mention that later as well. I also mentioned another word, language revitalization, and it's a bit different, even though it's also, of course, in some ways related to language documentation. But language revitalization, as we know, is meant the goal of language revitalization is to take actions to revive the use of a particular language, broaden the circle of users, or to protect the language from extinction. In some contexts, language documentation data the corpus of data is not suitable for language revitalization because, for example, what we have in language documentation can include unusual, interesting, intriguing features of a language, but we don't necessarily need to use it in language revitalization context. Also, a language documentation contains lots of probably materials from the elderly speakers who might look nostalgically at the past, at the good old days, but not necessarily we need this kind of data for language revitalization. And also, very often, language data collected through language documentation might have been produced in orthographies or scripts that are unknown to current users. Language corpora in general are empirically sound descriptions of endangered languages, for example, and they can be, even though we, for example, don't do anything currently with a given corpus, they are perfect vehicles to contain data for future computational linguistics on experiments on these languages. Metadata is extremely important when creating corpora. I'm going to show you a very simple example of how to create a corpus and metadata in a TXT file. So, for example, we can annotate metadata with a hashtag, and then we have to inform about the genre of a given text, the title, the source, the author of a given text, and of course, the more metadata, the better. For computational tasks devoted to under-resourced languages, I would like to recommend the framework developed by Bender and Friedrum in 2018. It's called Data Statements, and it prevents the researchers from oversimplifying or underrepresenting given communities that we deal with in our research experiments. Here, I would like to move more to the main topic of this meeting. So, I would like to ask you in the audience, what do you think? Like, why languages have versatile orthographies and scripts? What's the reason for that? We need a microphone for the audience. Yes.
Thank you, Asia. Well, I think there is a lot of reasons why that might be. But for instance, in the context of South America, a lot of people choose to have the Spanish orthography so that people wouldn't have to relearn a new orthography and they can write as they hear. So that just makes it simpler. But for instance, in North America, people tend to develop their own orthography just to make their language stand out. So I think there is a lot of reasons why that might be, eh?
Yes, thank you. Are there any other ideas? Thank you very much, Kasia.
Yeah, like, hi, Joanna. Like, I have one context with reference to Indian scripts. Like, depending on historically, like the people used to write on leaves, and what we can find in South India is that like there are some areas which have trees which have very soft leaves. So when we look at the scriptures, they are more round and continuous in nature. But if you go to the north part of India, so they mostly wrote on stones. So in that case, the scripts have more structured form of writing. So this was one context like which we observed, like why the scripts are different in different part of the India.
Thank you very much, Arvind. Are there any other ideas or comments? Yes, please, Agnieszka.
So I think, well, languages have also changed historically, right? So people would have a slightly different pronunciation in the previous ages that would be reflected in the orthography, right? And then the pronunciation would change for many reasons, right? Maybe language contact, maybe just changes within the language, and the orthography stayed, or sometimes it was adapted to the changes, right? So this is it.
Thank you.
And also, sometimes they were imposed on certain communities. Yes, so they were by the invaders or.
Yes, thank you very much for your answers. I see that there are lots of insights into this topic, and I find it in general very interesting. Also to see that, for example, orthographies can be a political statement or choice. And could you maybe share some examples where you encountered different scripts or orthographies for a given language? I believe Kasia has just answered this question as well, but maybe there are other ideas as well among the audience.
I think the question is if we have encountered any languages that do not have multiple scripts and multiple orthographies, because I don't know any. I mean, scripts, yes, but orthographies actually. I mean, I don't know any single language that would just have one orthography. Except for Polish, maybe.
May I share with you an example from Basque? So, the use or not of the letter H has been a big struggle in the revitalization process, because historically, in some dialects, the H has been used because it had an aspirational phoneme, etc., whereas other dialects didn't use never in their traditions. So there are many differences.
Thank you. Daniel, yes?
Thank you. So when we speak about heritage language education, for example, in Austria, it's a very interesting question, ideological question. about Bosnian, Serbian, Croat, then also Montenegrin, and should pupils be taught all of them by one teacher, or should it be separately taught? And I find it also interesting about European Union when later onwards Montenegro will join. How will it be then with Croatia? So it's interesting topic. I hope it fits into the discussion.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Daniel. Yes, it's let's look forward to this discussion in the future when Montenegro joins. Yes. Okay, so also I wanted to share some examples from my fieldwork. So, for example, on this photo you can see the Dara'ang community in Thailand that I work with, and the speakers of this community, they use Thai language script. I mean, not Thai language, Thai script. So the Thai visual representation of Dara'ang language. However, it's a refugee community from Myanmar. So the other Dara'ang speakers who are on the other side of the Thai-Myanmar border, they use Burmese script to record their contemporary language. So this is just one of the examples. Another example from my fieldwork also represents the Urak Lawoi community, the seaside nomads from southern Thailand, from the Krabi province. As you can see on the left-hand side, Urak Lawoi community, so the materials developed by the university researchers for Urak Lawoi are in the Thai script. However, I heard on numerous occasions that there were also attempts to make. So Urak Lawoi is from Malayic language family. So there were also proposals to introduce different script for Urak Lawoi. However, the direction in which the development of contemporary script goes is dominated by the location of the researchers at the institutions who work with this language in Thailand. Also, a contemporary Mongolian language also is written in Cyrillic, and it was introduced in the 30s. As an affiliation to the Soviet power in the neighboring country, but recently there were attempts to introduce the classical Mongolian script not only on shields and diplomas and signage, but also in everyday use. Also the laws have been passed in order to introduce this kind of reform. But from what I heard and learned also and read, still the Cyrillic script is rather more widely used in Mongolia. Okay, so now I have a question to the audience again. So how do you think? What's your opinion on that? Can we have different orthographies of one language in a corpus? What would you think about it? Or what would be your guess?
Thanks, Joanna. I would say yes, perhaps noting that down in the metadata. Going back to a point that Paul made, so that people know what to expect and decide how to use their corpus alongside other resources, whether to give an alternative view of orthographic systems or to be consistent. So I don't know if that could be a good option. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Federico and Agnieszka.
Okay, I would say no. I think that okay, maybe we could have them, but in a very orderly manner, so that something will be written in one script, and underneath there will be something rewritten in the common orthography, probably, because otherwise it would be impossible to process that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my take on this.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Okay, so in general, I'll base my answer on what I found out based on the literature review and also creating a corpus. So, indeed, yes, we can have this variability of orthographies in a corpus. Of course, if we build tools, then we have to decide on some compromise. But in the corpus itself, it's of course possible to have various scripts and even various, so not only orthographies, but also scripts, even though in computational linguistics, very often it's called a noise. So actually, if we analyze, for example, parts of speech tagging in corpora, and we see different orthographies, in the jargon, it would be called a noise. However, of course, as we can see, it's a derogatory term, and I hope that it will change in the future. And here, just as an example, maybe it can be useful for you in the future to reference. I wanted to point, for example, to Low Saxon tree bank in the universal dependencies from 2021, where we have two different types of script, so original ad hoc pronunciation, spelling, and also a newly proposed orthography for Low Saxon. And here I also wanted to mention another example, for example, the Alsatian language from the area close to Strasbourg. So I wanted to present the universal dependencies Alemannic digital corpus. And here is a quotation that I think very nicely explains why in the contemporary times we have a different spelling for an under-resourced language from several Western European regions. So maybe I'll read this quote. So there is no widely used written standard for Alsatian. Various spelling systems have been developed and proposed to make it possible for all speakers to write in their own variety of Alsatian with shared grapheme to morpheme rules. However, most speakers are not familiar with these spelling systems, and there is thus a lot of variation in how speakers write Alsatian, depending both on the specific variety they speak and on the degree of influence of French and standard German spelling. So even the country where the language is spoken, the dominant language of the country where the language is spoken also dominates the way how the language is spelled. Also here I wanted to mention that together with Professor Delphine Bernard, we carried out some experiments, and she created a corpus of Alsatian language where she included different orthographies, and she was even able to create a machine translation tool from German into Alsatian with included these different orthographies. So I believe that where there is a goodwill, there's also possibilities to include all the varieties and scripts and treat them as a treasure, as something that shows that the language is alive, and not treat it as a noise or burden. So I mentioned the universal dependencies, and I would like to recommend everyone this resource if you would like to build your own corpus in a very simple way. In the universal dependencies, you have various tree banks for many languages. It's an open source tool, and you can see very nicely how the same parts of speech categories are applied to languages that come from different language families. The corpora are organized in tree banks. You can find various languages, also under-resourced languages in this resource. And of course, just like Paul mentioned, we always need to remember about quoting the authors of a given corpus, also from the universal dependencies. And now I would like to move slightly to the topic of analyzing text in computational linguistics. Well, what are the basic examples of language processing tools? Because we talk a lot about it. We talk about machine translation and automatic speech recognition, but when we go several levels lower, then we can, for example, start our adventure with carrying out computational linguistics experiments, for example, by carrying out word tokenization and segmentation. We can also do parts of speech tagging. Or, for example, we can work on the named entity recognition. So by the last one, I mean, for example, analyzing some newspapers, let's say from the 1920s, and we can search for the main named entities, meaning the family names, the countries, the names of political parties, and, for example, carry out some discourse analysis of a given of a given text. So we can use the language processing tools in order to understand the social linguistic reality of a given period, if we have good resources for that. And on which dimensions can a text be analyzed? Well, of course, on the sentence level, on the paragraph level, and on the document level. And when we work with languages, and it refers both to dominant and under-resourced languages, we can either use dictionary-based tools, which means that we have to create like a dictionary and database, and then we use particular items from this dictionary to categorize words in the text. Or we can, for example, work with data-driven methods, which means that we rely on some patterns, and then we quantify them when we carry out the experiment, and then we use computational or statistical models. And from what I in general grasped from the literature review, I believe that the hybrid approaches are the best, because on the one hand, if we want to use the dictionary-based tool, then we have to have this dictionary for every language that we work with. And if we want to use the database, the data-driven method, then we also need to have the several corpora tagged in exactly the same way. So that's why universal dependencies that I mentioned before is a very nice resource that can help us unify our, for example, parts of speech tagging when we work with very different languages, like let's say English and Basque. Paul mentioned today the term heritage and also legacy data, and I also wanted to stay shortly on this topic. Very recently, I was in a conference where we discussed this topic, and someone asked like how old data needs to be heritage or legacy data. And actually, we didn't come up with a straightforward answer. But in general, heritage data or legacy data is data that was created in the past. It might be that it was created, for example, by missionaries, by military officials, by biologists, further in the past, but it can also be, for example, data collected by linguists who don't work on this particular topic anymore because they aged, for example, or they, for some reasons, they are not able to continue their work. So in terms of academic work, I learned also that researchers who inherit the linguistic data from other linguists can also work in some way with legacy data. I started like really thinking about linguistic data legacy data when I read the article by Blokland et alia devoted to Syrian Komi language in Russia, and I recommend it because it reflects on how old data can be incorporated into new corpora. So also when we work with legacy data or heritage data, we have to take into consideration the author's rights. Very often it's unclear. So of course we also need to check this. Even if the data is, for example, online, we still have to make our own investigation if we can use it in our corpus. And also when it comes to accessing the data from legacy data sets, sometimes we might encounter some problems. For example, we have to retype everything because it's a photo and it cannot be OCR'd in a good way. Or also we can build our own OCR. For example, if the material is in a script that is not very widely present online. I just wanted to mention briefly an example of how I worked with legacy data. I worked with the Dagur language, which is a Mongolic language, easternmost language in northern China. Maybe I'll skip here the description, but very generally, Dagur is considered to have the most archetypical features of the Middle Mongolian language. And Middle Mongolian language is the ancestor of all the Mongolic languages. When Genghis Khan started his campaign in Asia and in Europe, more or less Mongolic languages were still unified in the form of Mongolic language. That means that the Mongolic language family has around 800 years, which is not a lot actually. So Dagur is spoken by around 130 people, and there's no unified written standard for Dagur language. There are several different scripts and orthographies. So one of them is the Manchu script, the other one is Latin script, and the third one is Cyrillic script. But even here, as you can see, both scripts are in Cyrillic, but they significantly differ. So on the left hand on the right hand, no, on the left hand side from your perspective, we have an older version. It's Cyrillic, but still with lots of diacritics and accents. On the right hand side, you can see a typeset text from 1980s, and this is how it looked in 1961. So together with my colleague, Professor Delphine Bernard, we created a Dagor language corpus. We also carried out some experiments on it. And we also had to make some decisions which spelling, which script we have to choose for the analysis and how to unify it. So this is where this corpus can be found. It contains 4,500 tokens and 550 sentences. It's not a big corpus. It's of experimental character, but if you have never worked on corpora, I think it's a good way to start to create it in a TXT file. I'm going to show you a picture of that very soon. So when we work with the low resource, under-resourced languages and we want to create a corpus, we have several challenges. So for example, the choice of the character of the corpus, what kind of text it will include, what is the author's rights issue situation, how to prepare it, and also what kind of OCR tool we can use. And also universal dependencies, that if we use them for tagging, they might be very helpful, but sometimes also misleading, because it's very difficult to find an adjective in a language, or adjective or a verb or or gerund, for example, in different languages than Indo-European, but still this is the framework that we work with in universal dependencies. I believe I don't have to explain in this group maybe how OCR works, but just in case, if we have a photo of a text and we want to process it somehow, we need some OCR tool to work on this particular photography. So this is an example of a very basic annotated corpus. I don't know if you can see from the back, but at the very top, we have metadata. So we have hashtag, and then we have the name of a language, a genre, source, script, title. And then we have to tokenize the text. So we have to divide it into several different parts, and then we can write the parts of speech next to it. And this might be the first step if you work with language that you don't know well, that is under-resourced, that there is not so much data for it. I believe that maybe we don't have so much time for an exercise. However, this presentation will also be published on the Fosterlang website. And if you are keen on working on this exercise, you can send me your results. And I'm happy to also advise you if there's anyone who would like to start working on the parts of speech tagging with universal dependencies. Here are also the guidelines for this task. And that would be all. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Joanna. Very interesting. I'd like to go back to one point as I was thinking myself about some of the important points you raised. And I want to go back to the point about spelling orthography variants, whether or not to include them and how and if, right? Because I kind of reflected on what Arvind and Paul presented, and I'm a written language person. I'm not interested in speech beyond using it, but I've never studied it and never will. But we're very tolerant of variability in speech. Like nobody would say, well, that's not perfect intonation, it's not perfect pronunciation. We're not going to include spoken data in a repository or in a spoken corpus, because we know that official standard pronunciation is an abstraction. Like nobody uses it in any language. It's just something you find in textbooks, in manuals. Doesn't that apply also to written language, which I understand is much more highly codified, and you know there's a lot more control since school in how you spell words, etc. But by that token, why is there an intrinsic difference between the written language in being more strict with the orthodoxy or correctness of the spelling, whereas with pronunciation we're very flexible, and you know nobody gets told you have a London accent, we're not including you. You have an Edinburgh accent, we're not including you in a spoken corpus of English, for example. Does the analogy hold? It's a genuine question because I was thinking about it myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico, for this question. It's actually it's a very inspiring question. And when I think about it, I believe it seems to me that we have more standardized, unified systems of scripts in under-resourced languages that are, so to say, contained in other countries, because maybe there is some move to unify a given standard to represent a given identity also through unified writing. But for example, when it refers to languages that are spoken at borderlands of two different countries, let's say Russia and China, for example, there are many languages like that. I think there's no unified movement, or maybe not strong enough to push forward one variation, let's say. Or in the sense of your question, I also think that we need to think who actually censors the corpora and whose idea it is not to include something and include something. I think maybe it's an old-fashioned view that there should be just one spelling, just like for national languages. But in general, technically, there is no reason why we should not include different scripts.
SAP and all the rest, there is deviance everywhere. So do we not include that because it's not the textbook dictionary version of the language? If that's the way that young people or some people use the language in WhatsApp or instant messaging, why not?
Definitely.
So, it all depends where you draw the line, and, similar considerations apply to the major widely used languages as they do maybe in some other sort of more niche minoritized languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this comment, Federico.
Any more questions here or online?
Yeah, hi, Joanna. Arvind here. I'm audible?
Hello. Hi, Arvind.
Yeah, so I have a small question regarding digitalization of our new script. So you mentioned that, you mentioned the steps that how we can come up with the new scripts for a language. So my only question is that how do we make that the digital version of that script also exists? Because when we are building any digital tools for a new language like minority language, so we need to digitalize the annotation and the audio files. So in case we are coming up with a new script, so how do we make sure that we also digitalize it?
Thank you very much for your question. If I'm misled, I think that this step needs to be communicated and discussed with the language community and that speaks this language if we work on new data. And this is how, by joint agreement, this is how academics and language minority speakers can decide on the form of this script in a corpus, if it's possible technically. But I believe that this is our responsibility to make it possible to consult this data.
So you mean that there is some universal group of linguistic who will who has some set of rules and they need to accept our proposal, that this is the version of script we are proposing for this new language?
Arvind, do you mean, I'm sorry, because I'm not sure if I understand your question. Do you mean the tagging of the universal categories for tagging this language? Yes.
Yes. Suppose we come up with a new script which doesn't exist digitally, right? So we come up with our own set of symbols, everything new. So how do we make sure that when we go for the digitalization of those scripts, it is universally accepted, and when we go for building tools for these new scripts, it doesn't it aligns well with the existing conventions.
Maybe I can add. So there is the Unicode standard for characters, and any new addition will have to go through a certain committee, and then characters can be added to that set. So there is a formal process for that to add newly developed characters.
So the ISO codes, yeah. So we see a lot of ISO codes, as I saw it on your slides. So we have to
Yeah, it's
go
not.
through
It's,
that
it's,
ISO.
it's similar, but it's the
Yeah,
Unicode
yeah.
standard in this case.
Thank you
Okay,
very much,
Unicode
Paul.
standard. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I got it now. Yeah, thank you.
Anything else to add?
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.